Mitch, let's talk about Coach Rhule and where he sits on this list. And he comes in at number 6 out of all 18, which is, to me, at first glance, that's pretty high for someone that went 5-7 last season, higher than guys like Luke Fickell and PJ Fleck, both teams the Huskers lost to last season. But based on everything he's accomplished so far at the university and what you saw out of all Big Ten teams last season, and then, shifting around where they may fall on certain lists, do you think 6 is too high or right on the nose for Rhule?
I think if you're basing it on his career, it's appropriate, and maybe he should be a spot or two higher even. Now, Luke Fickell has taken a team to the college football playoff. Both of these coaches, they're an interesting comparison, but both of these coaches, Fickell and Rhule at Wisconsin and Nebraska, they have the resume to be able to rank high, and there was some level of struggle in the first year for both to get them to the place that they wanted to be. I don't know how they're coming to these conclusions, but I would guess it's more career oriented than just the last season, like where you see this coach at today based on what he did in the last 1 year. No, I think it's more for Rhule about the job that he did at Baylor, the job that he did at Temple. And in that respect, yeah, this is his third program, and it's the third one that he's either turned around or has appeared to get pointed in the right direction. And that's what's going on at Nebraska right now. There's been significant change at Nebraska on the roster, on the culture in the program. I think just on the feeling around Nebraska football and the direction that the Huskers appear to be pointed. The change has been, I would say just short of monumental in the last 14 or 15 months. Now, we can look back to 2018, 2019, and there were the same kind of vibes going into year 2 for Scott Frost. Remember, his team was picked to win the Big Ten West by many going into 2019. So it's not like a lockdown thing that just because Rhule appears at this point, at this stage in his program building to have got it pointed in the right way, that it's all going to continue that way. And it's just, 10 wins are around the corner. That's to be determined, but I think his ranking is appropriate. And I probably would have him under consideration to be ranked even higher if I sat down and looked at all 18 of the coaches.
Mitch, do you think maybe national influence for Nebraska and the way and where they put Coach Rhule on lists like this may be there because of the addition of Dylan Raiola and how often Nebraska's kind of been talked about over the last month or two, knowing that they secured the number 1 quarterback recruit in the country?
Well, again, I don't know the criteria, but
it gotta help though, right?
Right. It certainly, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to sign. And that's part of the reason that Nebraska appears to be pointed in a good direction. If Nebraska had stood pat with its quarterback spot after the 23 season, and we were going into the spring with what Nebraska had last year, probably take Jeff Sims out of it. I don't think there was really any path for him to come back. But if you just had Chubba Purdy and Heinrich Harburg, I don't think there would be as much buzz around Nebraska football, and that probably would impact his spot because it's a human decision. But again, like, are you taking 50% of this ranking and putting and basing that on where the team, like the 2024 team looks right now, and then the other 50% is the work that a coach has done over his career? I don't know. Maybe it's not weighted that way. But if it is, or if there's much weight at all placed on what's happening in the moment, then the success that Nebraska's had in reshaping its roster just in the last 2 months, I think does factor positively for the Huskers in something like this. And I get there's a bigger discussion here. It's not necessarily about like ranking the coaches. It's about where is Nebraska in the hierarchy of the Big Ten, just from a larger discussion. Forget the fact that there's a ranking out there. It's just, how is Nebraska going to fare as the league expands and moves into deeper waters in college football, and being prominent, being discussed, talked about in the national conversation. I think it is something that helps Nebraska's standing. It is something that matters to observers around the sport, to fans, to recruits, to players in the program, players outside of the program, who might be in the portal someday. It all plays into it, and they're trending well in that way.
We're talking with Mitch Sherman of The Athletic. Changing gears here on you a little bit, Mitch. Nebraska released a updated roster this week, and obviously there were some names left off that were sort of notable, no like earth-shaking ones. But as Nebraska moves towards getting to the number they need to, how does that look in your mind? Because they still have a lot of work to do numbers-wise to get to the, 115 that they need to be at? And I think they're still at 149. Just in your mind, how does that process start to work here as we go through spring and into the summer?
Right. Well, it's open for discussion where Nebraska needs to get to. 115 is the number that you can invite to preseason camp, but there's always players who are left off that list and then join the team when school begins later in August. Now, Nebraska has set a goal, short-term and long-term, to have its roster at a manageable spot. And for Matt Rhule, that probably looks like about 120 players. That's not to say that there's a hard and fast situation where on August 1st this year, they've got to be at 120 players. I would suspect, and we'll see, when the next semester starts and we get another updated roster, and generally that's about when these things come out. It's at once every 6 months. We'll see then. I guess it's more than 6 months in August because you have the summer built in there, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. 8 months. How close they can get to 120. I think it'll be a bit above that. There is work to be done. I think some of that will take care of itself in the spring, and they're not going to run players off. They're not going to tell players you have to go. But I think there's a competitive environment that exists, and it's going on right now in the weight room. It's going as on the mat when these guys get in, do the mat drills, which is not a literal mat, but it's the turf at the Hawks Championship Center or in the stadium on a day like today when they can enjoy the sun and go outside in February. But there's competition and all of that stuff, and it's not just competition to win the team oriented drill or to enter spring as the number one or the number two player at your position. It's competition in a lot of cases to be a part of this program, because they're heading, as an athletic department, they're heading to a place where they have to be more in line numerically just for Title IX purposes. And part of the way to get there is to make that football roster about 120 deep. And whether it's this year or next year where they hit that mark, we'll see. But it's about competing, and it happens every day in the program.
Mitch, a little bit this morning and a lot last week, we talked about ownership and that quality with Coach Rhule, someone not afraid to line up on the front lines and someone who knows exactly who he is. And then over the weekend, you continue to hear, how honest and upfront he is on his recruiting visits, not only winning over the recruit, but also the family of that recruit. Finding impactful stories is a strength of yours. So I'm curious if there's a story that sticks with you showcasing Rhule's impact on a recruit after visiting for the first time.
I think they all have their own stories. There's not one in the I had to give it some thought. I think in the 23 class, his first class, we've had more time to let that one sink in. In the 24s, you're still learning about all of these guys. In 23, I think it's he had an impact on, let's go with some of the players locally here who were added to the class after Matt Rhule took over Nebraska football in late November of 2022. And there were some guys who, Jalen Lloyd, great example, somebody who made a difference in the Nebraska program as a true freshman, had not been offered a scholarship when Matt Rhule took over 15 months ago. And, they went after him right away. Evan Cooper identified Lloyd as an athlete that they wanted to have in the program. Rhule got involved, started talking to the family. And it was a quick process where, and I think this carries over to the 24 class, the 25 class. He's easy to get to know. He was for that family. They felt comfortable with him from the beginning. He's a trusting figure in the recruiting process. You saw it again. I'll stay with a local story, but in the 24 class with Daniel Kalen, when there was the potential, not just once, but at least twice for it to be, and it was difficult. It was difficult for Daniel Kalen when Nebraska was heavily involved with Dylan Raiola after he decommitted from Ohio State more than a year ago. At this time last year, Kalen, while his heart resided in Nebraska, he had to do what was best for him and look at other options, ended up committing to Missouri. And Matt Rhule played it masterfully. Matt Rhule and his coaching staff played it masterfully to keep themselves in the good graces of him as a player, so that if something happened down the road, they could come back to him. And they did later in the spring when Dylan committed to Georgia. And then again, another situation came up, of course, as we all know, in December. And Kalen again had the opportunity to look around, turn down the chance to take a visit to Michigan State at the last minute, and ends up signing with Nebraska and giving Nebraska 2 quarterbacks in this freshman class. And as you look at it now, it's much needed. There's only 3 on scholarship in the program, so you need everybody that you got. And I don't think that happens with Kalen, if not for the kind of relationship building that Matt Rhule prioritizes, not just in recruiting when you're trying to seek a commitment, but in recruiting all through the process. There was a time with Kalen where they were not looking for him to commit, and they still had to maintain a relationship with him that eventually led him to be in Lincoln.
We're talking with Mitch Sherman of The Athletic. Mitch, something we haven't talked a ton about, certainly with you, but really even on our program in general, is the fact that there was some shakeup in support staff recently in the Nebraska football offices. So I guess a couple questions for you here. What, if anything, do you know about kind of why those changes took place? And kind of more broadly, how much in your mind does some of those support staff positions actually impact what we end up seeing on Saturdays?
Yeah, I mean, he has a large staff. It's like 60 full-time people. It's quite a bit bigger than what Frost had at Nebraska in his years, and his staff was big by standards that preceded him. So what you're going to see when you have that large number of people working for you as a coach is there's going to be turnover. There's going to be some churn. Rhule is an advocate for the guys who work for him, and not just the full-time coaches, but for the people on his support staff. He wants them to advance in their careers, whether that's to advance into another role at Nebraska, a promotion, or to go have a chance to coach or be an administrator at another program. He's gonna be in the corner of those guys. And not every situation is the same. You can't look at like Omar Hales who left from the recruiting department, and CJ Cavazos. There were Mike Wallace. There were several. Gordon Thomas was in operations. All of these guys left, and there's not like one overriding reason. But I think all of it is that Rhule fights for his guys to be able to have a chance to advance in their careers, and that is connected, I would say, to just about all of the situations where you saw people leave. And you'll see this, I think, every offseason with Matt Rhule. He didn't lose any assistant coaches this year. He did reassign Josh Martin back into the role of being an analyst, and Martin, as of now, is sticking with the program. So that says something also about the way that Rhule leads. So you ask about the impact that some of those administrative positions have on the program. I think some of those people are important in recruiting, in helping Nebraska develop relationships. There's things that non-coaches, people in non-coaching roles can do to help communicate with recruits early, especially early in the process, but even all through the process, to just keep Nebraska on the radar. And they were, Hales had a personality that appealed to recruits for sure, but on the current side of this, where Nebraska's moving to, some of the people who've moved on have given others opportunities that where I think it can be beneficial to the program. We've seen Phil Simpson and Keith Williams advance in their roles with the Huskers, and even get a chance to get out on the road and recruit as they were going through some change and some different roles with the full-time staff. So those guys having expanded roles is nothing but good for Nebraska. And part of what helps create that is to have others seek opportunities outside the program. And that's what we've seen happen here over the last 6 weeks.
Mitch, you wrote a nice piece on The Athletic when you went through a Nebraska football checklist, questions for Coach Rhule heading into the spring of 2024. And one part of that stood out to me, and I'd love for you to expand on it, because last year at the spring game, Dylan Raiola drew a ton of interest, bringing 4s and 5s there too, but Nebraska struck out on those elite prospects. But now that he's actually a part of the team, do you think the staff is in a better position to hit a few of those home runs at this year's spring game?
Yeah. I don't know if they're going to go out and sign 3 more 5-stars or, a bunch of top 100 players. We'll see. It's not early in the 25 process necessarily, because some of these guys, they've been on for a year or even longer. But as far as like putting the class together and getting the pieces in order, they've got a ways to go. So I think they're more positioned just because of the development in the program than they were a year ago to be able to land commitments from some of the players that they brought in. And what they were banking on last year was for it to just be kind of a snowball effect. Obviously they wanted Dylan Raiola to commit in the spring last year. They weren't putting pressure on him and saying, you got to do this or you're out. That's not what happened. But the quicker you can get a quarterback as a centerpiece in your class, and that applies to the 25 class too, the easier it is to get others to jump on board. So you've got the guy in the 24 class, and he can help Nebraska for sure with the players who are 1 year younger. He'll be a factor. He's already been a factor, I think, in helping Nebraska in the transfer portal, and we saw that in December. But yeah, as players come in this spring for unofficial visits during spring practice, when we get toward the end of March and into April, and then in June when the official visit season gets going, I do think it'll be a different approach. Nebraska had to kind of shift gears a year ago and go from like shooting for those big prospects in the spring to really making it more of like a grassroots mission in June, where they went to camps, both satellite camps on the road in Texas and hosted their camps in Lincoln, and that's where they gain momentum. I think it'll be a little bit different this year. I think it'll be more like multi-pronged, where you can develop momentum from the spring visitors who come in to see your team practice, and they're going to see a different product on the field practicing for Nebraska in the spring of 24 than recruits saw in the spring of 23. In the spring of 23, Matt Rhule's team had not played a game yet. And now they've got 12 under their belt. They have leaders who are coming back who understand what it's like to play in this organization, to be a part of this team. Those players, I think maybe even more so than a guy like Dylan Raiola, who's still just getting his feet wet, are going to be able to impact prospects who come in, because they can tell those kids and their families what it's like to play for Matt Rhule. Yeah, Raiola's a factor because he's, whether they want him to be or not, he's one of the faces of the program just because of who he is. So he'll be a factor in recruiting all throughout. But I think also it's important not to overlook the advantage they have over a year ago with having older veterans in the program who've been through a full season with Matt Rhule and his staff.
Mitch Sherman from The Athletic. Mitch, we appreciate your time as always. We'll catch up again soon.
Okay, good to talk to you guys. Thanks.
Thanks, Mitch.
That's Mitch Sherman from The Athletic. More Hurrdat Sports Radio coming up next.